It was the evening of October 31st, 2024. The wind raged through the jagged rocks and steep slopes of Langtang Lirungs' unclimable eastern face. Marek Holecek stood at what he thought was the bottom of a crevasse, but his rope seemed to continue into the darkness below him forever. He was somewhere between 6,000 and 5,500 meters, but he wasn't exactly sure where. He was exhausted. It was his 7th day of climbing. In less than 24 hours prior, Mara and his climbing partner, Ondra Huserka, had conquered a mountain face that had never been climbed before, completing a climb that many thought impossible. This is a peak that has only had 14 successful ascents in over 75 years, and not one on the east face until this year. Here, Mara was standing at the bottom of a crevasse, somewhere on the mountain, searching for his climbing partner who had fallen straight into the black void just moments ago. Mara heard one word over and over, faint and muffled by the icy walls. Help. Ondra was still alive, and Mara followed his voice in the darkness. He would find a small opening in the ice and begin crawling on his belly diagonally down a narrow tube. The light was fading behind him until he couldn't see an inch in front of his face, but Mara continued down, following the painful cry. In the darkness, Mara felt Ondra's hand first. For a second, the crushing fear and claustrophobia melted away. He found his partner, and he was still alive. Mara tried pulling his partner to him, but it was useless. After a few minutes of struggling, he began cutting through the backpack still attached to his partner. It was wedged between Ondra and a wall of ice, and as Mara cut, items began falling in front of him. Finally, Mara had some luck. Ondra's headlamp had dropped in front of him, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Mara could see. But nothing could prepare him for what he would see after those icy walls were lit. This is his story. Langtang Lirungs, standing at 7,234 meters, or 23,734 feet, is part of a sub-range of mountains in the Nepalese Himalayas. The peak is located just southwest of Shishapangma, the 14th tallest mountain in the world, and lies in Everest's shadow. But Langtang Lirung is arguably even more dangerous than the taller peaks. Since its first approach in 1949, 51 teams have attempted to climb it, but only 14 have been successful. The last successful attempt before 2024 was in 2010. Out of those 14 expeditions, 54 climbers have stood on its summit, and there have been 16 deaths, meaning it has a summit-to-death ratio of nearly 30%. Statistically, it is one of the deadliest mountains on our planet. Commercial teams don't dare attempt this peak. The only people going here are experienced mountaineers, looking to accomplish something very few have. From 1949 to 1978, a half dozen attempts were made to scale the peak, but nobody was successful. It wasn't until 1978 that the first team finally reached the top while climbing the southeast ridge. There is no easy face to scale because of the extreme temperatures, incredibly steep slopes, and consistent avalanches. Most expeditions climb via the southeast and southwest ridges, as they provide the most protection from rock falls and avalanches. There have only been a few attempts of the south face, and until 2010, none were successful. Climbers must navigate a series of snow and ice gullies, a rib, and an airy rock buttress before the steep ice air rate leads to the summit. Avalanches are a consistent threat. The heavy snow near the roof of the peak has stopped most expeditions, but in 2009, a renowned Slovenian alpinist lost his life after falling and then freezing to death on the south face. He could not descend the peak due to his injuries during the fall. Finally, in 2010, an Iranian team conquered the route. But the most dangerous and difficult approach is from the east side. The east face is steeper and more technical than any other approach. In some cases, avalanches have engulfed nearly the entire face, reaching base camp. Most of the route is almost vertical ice climbing, and there are very few flat locations where a team can set up a camp safely. Once you step out of base camp onto the east face, you are taking a risk, there are no completely safe areas. Before 2024, there were only 3 attempts on the east face, and the highest anyone had ever reached was 5,800 meters in 2017. On October 20th, 2024, 4 men were eating breakfast in the shadow of Langtang Lirungs at 4,500 meters. They were preparing to start their climb of the east face from base camp. The group comprised Ondra Huserka, Ondra Merklovsky, Pavel Hodak, and Marek Holecek, or Mara. Mara and Ondra Merklovsky had spent years climbing together, so they were familiar with each other's styles. The plan was for both Ondras and Mara to climb the east face, while Pavel stayed at base camp as a liaison to the rest of the world and to support the other 3. Acclimatization to different altitudes is one of the most important survival factors when climbing a mountain. Depending on the height, this usually means spending anywhere from a few hours to several days at various camps, allowing the body to adjust to the higher altitudes and lower oxygen levels. Since Langtang Lirungs was so dangerous, the team decided to go to Nepal nearly a month earlier than their expedition start date. This was so they could acclimatize on a nearby peak, Nyakanga, which would adequately prepare them for the actual expedition, while significantly decreasing the time they needed to spend on the more dangerous peak. The actual base camp is located in scenery straight out of a movie. The camp lies on a thin layer of grass, kept tidy from the wandering yaks. The greenery is interwoven with small waterfalls and streams, but just behind the perfect landscape are the rocky, icy slopes of the peak. The plan was to begin climbing before sunrise because the first 1,000 meters is a problematic, steep, rocky section with a nearly perfect funnel for avalanches. They would bivouac on top of the rocky outcrop around 5,500 meters, then complete another rugged, slick, rocky, and ice couloir before setting up another bivouac at 5,800 meters. Then a nearly vertical, exposed rock climb, followed by a mixture of snow and ice to 6,300 meters. Finally, above this point, there was more snow and ice, which was still difficult, but it made the mixed terrain climbing a little more bearable. The next bivouac would be set up at 6,800 meters, then a final push to the summit ridge through shin-deep snow. Finally, the last bivouac would be placed at 7,100 meters, where the final summit push would occur. Although this was their rough plan, most of the route had never been climbed, so the 3 climbers knew they had to be flexible, as their plans could change instantly. For example, they might reach a bivouac location, but there would not be sufficient space. They prepared themselves for all scenarios, but you can only prepare so much. When the 3 climbers started their expedition on October 20th, things went wrong. The sun's red glow reflected off the snow and ice, and with it came a warm breeze. This shift in weather brought changes to the mountain almost instantly. As the 3 men climbed, they could hear the cracking ice and falling rocks above them, and by 10 a.m. they were taking cover under a small rock overhang. As they took shelter from the falling debris above, clouds started to make their way in from below, making it impossible for the trio to retreat. They were stuck only hours after beginning their expedition. They couldn't climb higher because of warm temperatures causing melting ice and snow to fall, and they couldn't climb lower back into a dangerous snowstorm. As the sun began to set, the trio would huddle into a small tent under the rock overhang. Slight snowfall had begun during the day, but that was the least of their problems. Over the next several hours, the men would be crushed by the immense pressure of snow falling from above, and each time, the rock overhang would save them, clearing the snow. What the men were experiencing was obvious. It was the most dangerous consequence of climbing Langtang Lirungs: unrelenting avalanches. The following day, the weather had improved enough for the trio to rappel back to base camp, but the events of that short climb would cause the younger of the Ondras to approach Mara and tell him that he would not go for a second attempt. Mara could not help but feel respect for him, knowing that the decision was difficult and that the young climber had many expeditions still in front of him. But Mara was getting older, and he wanted this climb. He looked at the other Ondra and asked if he still wanted to continue, to which he stated, "I'm going on," with a smile. The next 4 days were spent waiting for the weather to improve. On October 25th, they would get their opening. Mara and Ondra would once again set out on the east face. this time earlier than before. The only light bounced off the rocks before them, radiating from their headlamps. They climbed with renewed ferocity, aimed to complete the dangerous avalanche funnel as quickly as possible. However, climbing the nearly vertical ice wall was challenging. The duo made painstakingly slow progress. A few hours in, Mara, climbing behind Ondra, was already starting to feel the effects of the climb. His breathing had become heavy in the darkness as he stayed close behind his partner, but the mountain would fight back. Mara heard the most dreaded word yelled down at him: avalanche. Mara immediately gripped his ice axe as tightly as possible, and with every ounce of strength he drove it into the icy wall, attempting to stabilize himself. Then he lowered his head and pushed his body as close to the wall as possible. Time seemed to drag on. Mara just sat there, preparing for the inevitability of Langtang Lirungs. Then it all happened at once. A mass of white darkness surrounded him, and he felt the pressure nearly crushing his body. His shoulders, head, and hands all ached. It only lasted a few moments, then the pressure was gone. Mara let out a massive sigh of relief as he realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. He quickly called up to Ondra and then began climbing again. What else was there to do besides climb? As the sun set in the sky, Ondra and Mara, only feet away from their bivouac site, would trigger another avalanche. This time, they weren't in the path of the falling snow, but it was a stark reminder of what had occurred earlier that day. The following 48 hours were spent slowly making their way up technical rock and ice faces. As the duo progressed, they constantly made subtle decisions on the route up the east face. When the mountain presented a safer opportunity from the avalanches, the duo would take it, but this made their progress slow. They climbed 300 meters on the 26th before setting up another bivouac and another 500 meters on the 27th. But the real challenges would begin on the 4th day of climbing. On the morning of October 28th, Mara and Ondra woke up early in their tent on a small hill between two rocks. Both men thought it was a miracle the tent had made it through the night, but they had chosen the best location for it the night before. That doesn't mean it was a good one. As the duo began climbing, the fatigue from the previous 3 days was setting in. They were exhausted, yet they pushed on. The following 12 hours would come with their own challenges, in particular, finding a place to bivouac for the night. But as the hours progressed, so did the duo. On day 5, they fought against shin-deep snow to the final summit ridge, but on day 6, the weather was perfect, almost as if the mountain rewarded the two climbers for making it as far as they did. Tears swelled in their eyes as Mara and Ondra made their way to the final ridge. Then they were there. The two men stood on the summit of Langtang Lirungs, becoming the first climbers to scale the east face successfully. I cannot express how difficult their climb was. There are so many details that I had to leave out of this story, but if you want to read about it in its entirety, I will link an article from Mara's point of view below. As the two men hugged on the summit, the emotions of their climb came crashing down against the backdrop of some of the tallest mountains in the world. They spent 10 minutes on the summit. That was all the time they could afford before starting their descent. They would make it down to 6,300 meters that same day before the sun began to set. They were descending via the easier northeast ridge, as the duo did not have the supplies or strength to descend the east face. They weren't sure anyone would ever be able to do that. On the 7th day of climbing, Mara led Ondra down the peak. He was exhausted, his fingers were frozen, and even the simplest tasks took 3 times as long as usual. The wind drowned out his heavy breathing as they zigzagged between thick snow and seracs. More than once, their steps would cause many avalanches further down the peak, but the duo had no choice but to continue, so they took each step forward, trying to forget about the risk of the climb. While rappelling a steep section of rock and ice, a large boulder would bounce off Ondra's helmet, leaving a permanent dent near the crown, but that was the extent of the damage, and the duo was grateful for that. As the day waned, the fading light offered little comfort. Just 2 hours remained, and Mara and Ondra faced the treacherous expanse ahead of them. More bypassing, more leaping over yawning crevasses. The ice bridges they traversed groaned ominously, threatening to collapse beneath their weight at any moment. Mara had no choice but to descend into the depths of each abyss, rappelling to lower levels just to press on. And then Mara came across another bridge, same as all the others. He would have to rappel to a lower level to cross. He drilled a hole into the icy wall, threading an anchor with trembling hands. His heart raced as he pulled a sling through, securing it with a knot that felt all too fragile. Above, he had drilled his second-to-last screw into the ice, a precarious anchor that doubled his already dwindling safety. Mara was left with just one screw from the original 8. The others were stuck in the ice behind him, and the final screw clung to his harness, serving no purpose but to make more holes in the ice. Cautiously, Mara lowered himself into the abyss, testing the belay with his weight. It held a brief sliver of reassurance, and he descended several meters, the cold air biting at his skin. As Mara traversed a narrow crevasse, each step felt like a gamble, the ropes trailing behind like serpents, loosening their grip on life. The edge loomed before him, a snow bridge leading to another daunting 20-meter drop. Mara cursed under his breath. Reluctantly, he returned to the crevasse, retrieving the tangled ends of their lifelines snared in the ice's maw. Mara called out to Ondra, the silence enveloping him like a shroud, inviting him to descend. Then it happened. A chilling whoop shattered the eerie stillness, followed by a dull thud, unsettling rustling, and then nothing but silence. Mara's instincts screamed as reality crashed in. He sprang over the crevasse, racing towards where the last remnants of their ropes vanished into the dark chasm. His calls echoed unanswered, swallowed by the icy abyss. Mara felt the goosebumps creep over his skin as he heard a muffled word come from the darkness. Help. He quickly drilled his last screw into the ice and began rappelling into the tight crevasse, screaming into the void that he was coming. The cold air thickened around him as he descended for what felt like hours. He finally reached what he thought was the bottom as he stood on an icy ledge, but the ropes continued into a small crack below him. Mara found a narrow tube angled downwards, so he crawled inside and began inching forward on his belly. As he crawled, the light around him began to fade until he was in total darkness, but he felt something that wasn't ice. It was Ondra's hand. Mara didn't know it in the darkness, but Ondra was suspended nearly upside down in the ice. Mara fumbled in the darkness, trying to free Ondra somehow, but it was futile. Mara pulled out his knife and began cutting away at Ondra's backpack as it was wedged between him and the ice wall. As he did so, the two men talked about trying to escape. Suddenly, Mara felt something hard fall near his head. He touched it in the darkness and realized it was Ondra's headlamp. Finally, something good. He quickly turned it on, and his brain finally realized the disaster before him. Ondra had slid headfirst into the crevasse. It was now suspended upside down. Mara could not reach him from the front, so he began pulling his legs to free his body from being wedged between the ice. After completing this, Ondra could finally turn around with Mara's help. It took over 2 hours to complete, and both men were panting in the tight space. The sun was already set, and there was nothing but cold and darkness around them. Ondra had no visible injuries on his body, but when Mara tried to get him to climb, he couldn't. It was as if he was paralyzed. His arms and legs barely worked. Mara's crampons slipped on the unforgiving ice as he tried to push Ondra up the icy tube. He needed help, and Ondra had to use his ice axes, which he just couldn't do. The ice around them was pure, and even with the right equipment, it was like trying to climb on a sheet of glass. Their crampons and ice axes gave them little support, so even small movements took extreme effort. As Mara pushed, it began to dawn on him. He asked Ondra if he could feel his legs, to which he heard the same mumbled remarks about getting him out. Mara realized that Ondra must have suffered some form of head injury. His responses were all the same, and he had little to no movement in his body. His face was bruised from the fall. There was nothing Mara could do. Shivering from the cold and exhaustion, Mara began preparing Ondra for the night. He wrapped him in a sleeping bag on the ground. Mara had left all his supplies on top of the crevasse as he rushed into the icy tunnel, so he was left with what Ondra was carrying. After wrapping him in the bag, Mara took off one of his feathery coats and put that on Ondra as well. But before Mara could finish, Ondra's breath began to weaken. Mara wrapped his arms around him, shaking him and crying out to him, but there was only silence, and soon, only one breath could be heard in the tunnel. Mara doesn't remember how long he sat there with his friend in his arms. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually his brain sent a shock of self-preservation. Mara would put down his partner and begin making his way out of the tunnel, but the ropes above him were frozen, and his crampons would not stick into the ice. As his headlamp began blinking, letting him know the battery was low, he started climbing up the crevasse using the chimney technique, praying the walls wouldn't become wide enough to where he would be unsuccessful. As he climbed, fear left his body. He had a purpose, which led him out of hell. After Mara reached the top, he threw things out of his frozen backpack. Shivering, he removed his crampons and jumped into his sleeping bag, his boots still on. Then he covered himself with his tent. His body was frozen and exhausted. Mara had kept one item, a small cooking pot so that he could melt snow. After he had a hot drink, he sent 2 SMS messages, one to Pavel in base camp and another to home. An accident happened. Ondra fell into a crevasse on the descent. He is dead. I couldn't help him anymore. I'm so sorry. I'll try to get down tomorrow. My battery is running low, so don't be alarmed if you don't hear from me tomorrow. Mara descended the peak the following day, crossing crevasses and glaciers that no human had ever stood on. It took him hours, and as he descended, he began to hear what sounded like a helicopter, then drones above him. It was clear to him that Pavel had kick-started rescue operations. At 4 p.m., Mara finally completed the last avalanche chute, and the terrain began to change. The ice and rock were gone, and he was standing on grass for the first time in 8 days. As he entered base camp, he found it empty, but he still grabbed a beer, a Coke, and some dried meat. As the darkness surrounded him, he put on tennis shoes and descended from base camp. After a half hour of walking, he suddenly saw a silhouette around the corner. It was Pavel. The 2 men embraced each other, and Mara could finally let his emotions go. The media frenzy was swift, and Mara would receive mixed emotions from those around him. In his own words, he stated, "The only thing that really saddened me were the expressions of hostility from those people from who I would have expected more understanding and support, including the opportunity to mutually share the pain over the loss." Once Mara was safe, rescue operations would begin to retrieve Ondra's body. Mara told the rescuers that he did not think it was a good idea because the location was extremely dangerous. He thought it was best to leave Ondra in his resting place rather than risk more lives. Even so, the rescue would take place. The first day yielded no results, but with the help of Mara reviewing video footage, the team was able to recover Ondra's body the following day. What Mara and Ondra accomplished on Langtang Lirungs was nothing short of extraordinary. Their climb may have been one of the most difficult of all time. Certainly, in 2024, 2 men climbed what many thought was an unclimbable route because it gave them joy. It was a climb of free choice, and they were aware of the potential risks. But that doesn't make Ondra's story any less devastating. Because they conquered the route, Mara, following tradition, would give it a name. He called the new route on Langtang Lirungs Ondra's Star.